Hey, Pin Dude here, my vintage pinball. Welcome back to Pinball Restoration on the 1990 Williams Rollergames. This is part number 5 of the restore, and we're going to get going right away with starting to put the head back together. If you saw part number 4, we finished all the paintwork on the head, and it's now fully buffed and waxed and completely ready to be reassembled. Most of the parts are strewn under blankets in the garage and are all restored, so this should go fairly quickly. So that's what we're going to do in this episode, part number 5, Pinball Restoration, Williams Rollergames. Let's get going. Alright, so we're going to get started with whatever the last part of the head that we took out is the first part that's going to go back in. And in the case of both the lower cabinet and the head, the last thing that you typically take out is the ground braid that is stapled throughout the cabinet, ground in all the metal parts within the cabinet. So you could reuse the old braid, but the old braid is usually kind of ugly. So we are using brand new flat braid. I got this on eBay. You can also get this on Pinside in the marketplace. One of the marketplace sellers sells this by the foot. I buy this by the foot. I probably bought this as a 50-foot roll, and I've done a few cabinets already. So we got that. You're also going to need a stapler, and if you're still hand stapling, I know I hand stapled a lot of cabinets for a while, I would highly recommend buying this air stapler. This is the Unicatch USC 71/16L. This is the long nose 22 gauge fine wire stapler. It's basically an upholstery stapler, and the long nose is important for pinball repair. I've mentioned this in some of my other videos. This is really for doing undersides of playfield, so you can get in to where you need to staple down. It's really important. Like I said, this is $60. I bought it on Amazon a few years ago. I believe it's still $60, and it is $60 well spent. This stapler works really good. You're also going to need staples, 22 gauge upholstery staples, 3/8 of an inch long, and most importantly, you want to make sure they're gold, because at least in the case of Williams, they used gold fine wire staples, and we want to replicate that. This is a box of 1,000 that I got on eBay. Also, to use this air stapler, obviously you need compressed air from your compressor. But you also need a way to regulate the air, because you only want to sink the staple so it's flush with the surface of the wood. You don't want it to be the air pressure to be too weak where the staple's not sunk enough. And most importantly, you don't want too much air pressure where it actually recesses the staple down into the wood, because then if it ever needs to be removed again, you got to gouge out and ruin the wood to get it out. So most important to have an air regulator. And what I did is I just made up this hose with the air regulator and the fittings so that I can use this setup very quickly on any tool. I just plug it in to my tool, plug the other end in compressed air, and I'm ready to go. I use this on my HVLP spray gun and whatever other air tool I'm using that needs a regulator. So it's a nice, easy setup to have. All right, so now that we got all the tools we need, let's start getting this in. Alright, so we're about to get started stapling the braid in. So you need to know where to staple it. So in the case of the cabinets, you can typically see where the staples that you remove during the disassembly process are, and you can use that as a guide to lay out your braid. And the other way is, hopefully you took a lot of pictures when you were disassembling. So I now have those pictures up on my computer in the garage right next to where I'm working here. I have close-up pictures of all the different sections of the head that show me where the ground braid was and how it was routed and how it was stapled, so we can get this ground braid in the right places. And there's a couple places where Williams ran the ground braid a little ugly. I'll be changing that so it's not as ugly, but you know, I need this as a guide so I know where I'm putting this ground braid. Alright, so I'm all ready to go. I used a scrap piece of wood to do some test staples to get my air pressure set on my air stapler. Typically it's right around, with my setup, it's usually right around 40 psi, and that's about where I ended up. And we'll adjust accordingly once we get the real staple, the first staple into the wood here. So we're going to get going. Alright, so we got the ground braid in, the corner braces, the back panel that the PCBs will attach to, the vent grate back there, and just some other miscellaneous hardware in there. And that's all I'm going to get done tonight. So we'll hopefully get a little more done tomorrow. Alright, most of the metal I'm using straight out of the tumbler with the corn cob media and the polishing metal compound. But some of the metal could use a little more shininess, so I'm using my 6-inch Harbor Freight bench grinder with the buffing wheels, and we're just going to buff up some of these pieces that need a little more help. Also, on most of these polished metal parts, I like to put a little just liquid car wax on them. It helps to protect them from rusting again. You know, if the game ever happens to be in another kind of moist environment once it leaves my hands. And it also helps to, once you buff this wax off, it leaves a real nice, even, shiny finish on the parts. And it doesn't take much time. You just wipe the wax on, let it dry for a few minutes until it hazes over, and then buff it off with, I use a diaper cloth. Anytime I'm buffing polished parts, I like to use a diaper cloth as opposed to a microfiber. Microfiber, maybe I buy cheap ones, I don't know, but they tend to leave little hairline scratches in my finish, and I never have that happen with diaper cloth. So I definitely like diaper cloth for any final buffing processes. Alright, I'm working on cleaning up the knocker coil assembly that we're going to be putting back together. And one major thing to note, if you're going to be reusing the coil sleeve, be very careful cleaning this. This black ink will come right off if you use like simple green or mean green on it, or even if something is as light as Windex. If you use Windex and wipe the coil sleeve, that black will come right off too. So what I do is I just use a blue shop towel here. I spray a little bit of Windex on it, and I just dab the coil. Just dabbing it to get the, you know, the black coil dust off it and make that yellow coil wrapper look a lot brighter. But I'm not wiping it because I don't want to ruin the graphic here. Some people print new coil labels and put those on. I'll do that if I have to, you know, if it has a replacement coil that doesn't have an original Williams label on it. But this one's in good shape, so we're just cleaning it. And then this plastic on the ends of the coils, I did use mean green on because these were kind of yellowed and disgusting black looking. So they cleaned up real good. And then on the inside, I spray a little mean green on a Q-tip, and I clean out the inside so it's nice and clean before I slide the new coil sleeve in there. Alright, so now we're going to put this knocker back together. We got our bracket, which is all polished up and waxed. I have this little baggie of some of the other parts of this assembly that have already gone through the 2 tumblers, the final being the corn cob with the mother's mag and aluminum polish, and you can see how shiny they come out. No further polishing needed on these parts. Same with the screws. And then we have a brand new coil sleeve. Anytime you're dealing with coil assemblies, you always want to put a brand new coil sleeve in. Make sure you get the right one. Make sure you match it up with the old one. If they are too long, you can trim them. And then on the coil, there is a little rubber bumper that looks like this, that the plunger sits on in the rest position. And these are usually dry rotted. This one's actually not in too bad a shape. But since I was doing a pinball life order anyway, and I was out of stock on these, I bought a new one. I also bought another one just to put back in my stock. And this goes on the end of the bracket here. They're a little bit of a bear to put in, and you have to be careful. You don't want to tear it. So we may have to use a little bit of lube. Using a little screwdriver, I'm just carefully pushing that in. There we go, that's in there. So that's the little bumper that the plunger will sit on there. And now we have to assemble this. Alright, so I only had about an hour and a half or so last night to work. I got a few more things bolted in here, and I don't have a lot of time to work tonight either. It's after work. That's why it takes me so long to get these darn restorations done. They take so much time, and then, you know, with a job and everything else, who has the time? It's also the start of a heat wave here in Jersey. It's 90 degrees out. Not super comfortable out here. Alright, so I got a little more done tonight, and for the first time got some of the electrical parts in. So I like to try to bulletproof the games the best I can. So we have a brand new bridge rectifier here. I got this from Ed at Great Plains Electronics. And also, don't forget, if you don't have any, he sells the little packets of the heatsink compound, because you need to put that compound on the bottom of the bridge rectifier where it touches the board here. That helps to dissipate the heat from the bridge rectifier to the back plate here to keep it cool. I always try to replace the bridge rectifiers. They are 30 to 35 years old at this point. And these newer ones are a higher amp rating. They should last forever at this point if we replace them. And it's cheap. It's only a couple dollars. Also, this is the fuse. It's an 8 amp fast blow on this game. I put a brand new fuse in. Of course, when I got the game, somebody shoved a 15 amp fuse in there, overfused the game. And I also put a new inline fuse holder in here. The old ones are typically corroded and the tin contacts get weak. These I also buy from Ed at Great Plains Electronics. They're cheap. I keep a bunch on hand. I always replace these on any game that I'm restoring. Tried to neaten up this wiring a little bit. I don't know, it was a rat's nest when it started. I think I made it a little better. The capacitor I checked, and it read on the meter the same ohm reading that it said, so we reused that. We just cleaned it up. So now this corner of the head is now done, and we can move on. Alright, so now we're going to begin a board work. Not a lot to do. This was a working game. Most of what we're going to be doing here is more for down the road, to prevent breakages down the road. We're just going to bulletproof a bunch of stuff. So I have a box here. This is kind of multiple orders that I've done with Great Plains since I got this game many months ago. I always try to order my parts early so that I have what I need when I need it. So let's see, we got a bunch of, this is actually the power supply high voltage repair kit from Great Plains Electronics. I also bought some miscellaneous stuff for doing, you know, just board work down the road. Not everything in here is for Rollergames. It's another high voltage kit to have in stock. These are resistors for the inline power supplies, voltage coming from the wall. It's good to have them in stock. And now capacitors for the power supply. Ed didn't have the System 11 kit available, so I just made a list of all the capacitors, and he actually had all the capacitors available separately. He just didn't have a kit together for it. So we got all the capacitors that we're going to need for rebuilding the power supply. We got new bridge rectifiers for one of the boards in the game. More capacitors, some fuses that I needed that I didn't have in stock that I'm going to need for Rollergames. More capacitors, header pins. These are the right angle ones that are on the display board. I didn't have any of these in stock. And these are the resistors for the flashers. And a lot of times these are burned up and stuff, but more importantly on this game we need to change these because we're going to be adding the 15 flashers to the insert panel. The 15 flashers that were removed after pre-production. They were removed from the production games. We're going to be adding them back in. So the resistors are a different value than the ones that are currently in the game. And then just some more fuses. So that is probably 3 different Great Plains orders. I don't know if you're like me, when you do a pinball order, there's always stuff you forget to order, so then you need to do another pinball order, which really stinks because the shipping really starts to add up. That's why it's so important to make a good list. When you get the game, start making a list of everything you're going to need, and hopefully this can be avoided, although I do make a list and I still miss stuff, so I guess it's kind of unavoidable in the hobby. Alright, so we got our power supply here. I cleaned it with a little mean green and water. And then I washed it off with some 91% alcohol. And then I blew dry it with my air compressor. So the board is nice and clean now. And I also went through my Great Plains order and pulled out all the capacitors that I need to do the power supply. We're going to start with doing the capacitor kit. Alright, so we're going to start with the big guy here. Cut off the zip tie that holds it on. Most notably, first thing to make sure, before you do a capacitor kit, make sure you have a good picture of the power supply. That's always helpful. And the other thing is to make sure the board is marked for positive. That's important to make sure you get the capacitor going the wrong way. The capacitors are marked for the negative side, and the board is usually marked with the positive side, so it's pretty easy to make sure you have them in the right way. If the board's not marked positive or negative, I'll usually take a little Sharpie and mark the positive side, but it looks like this board is marked, every capacitor is marked for positive, so we're good to go. So we just need to see where we're going here. And just like any other thing we remove, we're going to add a little bit of solder. And get our desoldering tool of choice. I could be doing this with my new desoldering gun, but capacitors are pretty easy to do just with a solder sucker. As you see, especially a heavy capacitor like this, it fell right off. And the holes look perfectly good. So we know that's that capacitor. I'm going to leave this out for now because I need to deal with this little guy here, and it'll be easier with the other one not in the way. Alright, so we got all the capacitors changed. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on this power supply, this System 11C. Here's all the old caps. I'm going to toss them. And now I just want to, you can see the shiny spots. That's flux. We just want to wash that off, so I'm just going to take some 91% alcohol and one of these acid brushes, I believe they're called. And we're just going to brush away some of that flux. And then we'll blow it off with our compressed air. And now we have a pretty good looking board. Alright, so I depopulated all the resistors, transistors, and diodes and everything in the high voltage section. The board is labeled very well, so I'm not worried about putting something in wrong. I also have good pictures of this. And one thing to note, if you buy the high voltage rebuild kit from Ed, none of the parts are labeled. And these are really small, so you're going to need a magnifying glass to be able to read what these components are, and then with a Sharpie I just wrote what they are after I looked through the magnifying glass to be able to identify all this stuff. Also, the resistors aren't labeled either, so we're going to have to look up the band colors and make sure we get the right parts in the right spot. But we are ready to repopulate the high voltage section now. Alright, I'm just finishing up the high voltage section rebuild kit, and I'm down to the last two Zener diodes, which are ZR4 and ZR2. And in the kit there are two different options. You can put a Zener diode that'll give you 100 volts to the displays, or you can put a Zener diode in that'll give you 91 volts to the displays. I like to put the 91 volts in. It'll make your displays slightly dimmer, but they will last longer, and these plasma glass displays are getting pretty hard to get nowadays, and they're pretty expensive, so the 91 volts will just make them last longer. Now in my case, when I play tested this game when I got it, the displays were kind of funky, and they didn't look real good. My fear is that I have bad glass for the displays, but I did have a couple resistors in here that tested a little funky. So I'm crossing my fingers that when we get this back together, the displays look okay. But I fully expect that I'm going to have to try to find some glass displays for my game. But let's finish up this high voltage rebuild kit with these last Zener diodes. Alright, so now we have the capacitors done, the high voltage rebuild kit's done. The next thing I like to do is I like to replace these 0.156 header pins. Mainly because these are all your powers, obviously. Power's going out to the CPU board. I could just clean some of the tarnish off these, and you need to reflow the header pins anyway. So I like to replace these on the power supply. So I just have 0.156 header pins that I bought from Ed at Great Plains Electronics. I buy them in the biggest size there is. These are 24 pin. And then I just use my dikes to cut it down to whatever size I need to use. So that's what we're going to do. For this, I'm going to use my new S993A. I could do it easily with my solder sucker, but it is quite time consuming to do one pin at a time with this. And since I have this tool now, we might as well use it. So let's get going. Alright, now got the first one in. The board is marked for which one was the key. That's why I didn't pay much attention to it when I was taking it out. So now that we have it in, we're just going to flush cut the key off of there. And that connector is all set to go, and we just got these other two to do. Alright, we got the power supply all done. Finished up that high voltage section down here. Caps are all done, and the last thing I did was I put all brand new fuses in. A lot of these fuses were the wrong value. There was one that was actually a fast blow fuse, and it was supposed to be a slow blow fuse. And one of the fuses, I went to take it out, I barely touched it, and the end cap fell off. So, you know, very important to check all your fuses before you fire up a game. Make sure they're the right value and make sure they're not broken. So this power supply is all ready to go back into the cabinet, so we're going to put this away and start working on the next board. Alright, so now we're going to start working on the Interconnect board. And this is the board that causes all the problems with your general illumination on these games. If you can see, I already did a bunch of work to this because when I bought the game, it had no general illumination lights at all. This whole section of the board was burned up. You can see discoloration, black discoloration on both sides of the boards. All these header pins were fried. The associated connectors that go into these header pins were fried. And you can see on the back side of the board, I had to do a bunch of jumper wires on traces. The trace here is completely missing, trace here completely missing, trace here completely missing. Just really, really bad. So I previously did this because before I tore the game down, I wanted to get the general illumination lights working to make sure there was no other problems in the circuit. So, you know, this wasn't too bad to rebuild. It's just replacing parts, making jumper wires, and just with your ohm meter, using the continuity buzz mode, checking all these traces. Make sure wherever these traces go that you have a connection. So now that's all done. There's not really much else on this board. It's basically just a transfer board. Wires come in, wires come out. But there are these resistors here, and these are for the flash lamps. So these will also burn up a lot. A lot of times you'll see discoloration. These will start to turn brown, and the green on the board underneath will also start to brownish blacken the board. These actually all look good, and I tested them. Testing them is real easy. Just take your voltmeter, put it on the ohm setting, and they say right on them, this one says 4 ohms. So if you check it with your ohm setting on your multimeter, you get 4 ohms on your meter. If you were to get some other weird number that's not 4 ohms, you know you need to change that resistor. Now in my case, like I have previously stated, I am adding the 15 flashers back to the insert panel, and these flashers are the wrong value for doing that. So I need to change these to the values that are in the instruction manual. So when I add the flashers back on, they're going to work properly. So I bought the 3 and 4 ohm ceramic resistors I need. I got these off of Ed at Great Plains Electronics. And we're just going to change these ones out. I already tested the resistors that I don't need to change, and they test good, so I'm going to leave them alone. So once we change these out and put new fuses in, the interconnect board will be done and we can move on. Alright, so we got these resistors all changed out. And also make sure, check these fuses. They're supposed to be 5 amp slow blow, all 4 of these 5 amp slow blow. I had one that was a 4 amp fast blow in here. I put 4 brand new 5 amp slow blows. I like to put brand new fuses in the games when I restore them, just so we know we're starting out with brand new fuses. So this board is now ready to go, and we're going to move on to the next board. I will go into more detail on adding the 15 flash lamps and all you have to do to change to that. I'll be doing a specific video on adding those 15 flash lamps at a later date. Alright, now we got the auxiliary power driver board out. We're going to go through this. I pulled all the fuses so that I can check them to make sure that they're correct. I reflowed all the header pins. That's important to do. There's nothing worse than tracing intermittent problems that are due to cracked solder joints on these header pins. It only takes 15 minutes or so to reflow all these with fresh solder. I also reflowed the solder joints on the bottom of this relay. You know, this relay sitting up on the board. It's heavy. A lot of times you get cracked solder joints under there. So we reflowed those. I'm going to change these 2 bridges. These are 35 amp 200 volt bridge rectifiers. The new ones that you get from Ed at Great Plains Electronics are 400 volt 35 amp bridge rectifiers. They're a lot beefier. They should last forever. These have a tendency to fail every now and again. So while I have the board out, and I ordered those anyway, we're going to change these 2 bridges. and I checked the tip 36 transistors using the diode tester on the multimeter. They check out okay. So I think once we get these bridges replaced and get all the correct fuses in, we'll be good to go with this board. Alright, we got the auxiliary driver board all done. Took these old 200 amp bridge rectifiers out, put new 400 amp bridge rectifiers in. That should last forever. We tested all these fuses. I continuity checked them on my meter. They were all good, but there was two that were overfused. Somebody had a 15 amp slow blow where there should have been a 7, and a 5 amp slow blow where there should have been a 2. So we got that all sorted out. Reflowed the solder joints, checked all these tip 36 transistors, checked these diodes with the diode test on the meter, and everything's checking out okay. So this board's done and we can move on. Alright, so now we got the soundboard. The soundboard worked fine, so all I'm going to do here is reflow the solder on the 0.156 header pins. Everything else looks good. We'll probably reseat these ROMs that are in sockets, and that'll be it for this board. Alright, so we got all the boards worked on, all gone through and bulletproofed, except for the CPU board. But I want to clean up a little bit and get these boards out of the way. So we're going to install the boards into the cabinet, and to do that I got my picture here, my before picture, so we can make sure we get the orientation of the boards correctly. So let's do that now. Alright, we got all the boards in except the CPU board. You want to make sure you snug these bolts down pretty good as the boards ground through those screw holes to the plate. You also want to make sure you have some of these screws on hand. I think they're 8/32 screws, and they have a built-in star washer, kind of a lock washer. There's always screws missing on these boards. Anytime you get a game, there's always screws missing. So make sure you have some on hand. And that's it. So now we got to get the CPU board out. We have a couple things we want to do to that, so let's do that now. Alright, before the head gets too heavy, we're going to bring it into the house and mate it with the cabinet. And we'll finish putting the rest of the parts in the head once it's back on the game. The head's pretty heavy once you get everything on there. I don't want to risk chipping the cabinet or anything. So let's get this started. Alright, head's on, sitting next to Back to the Future here, looking pretty sharp. So now let's get working on that CPU board. Alright, so I got the CPU board out. This is a System 11C CPU board for Rollergames. System 11C, the main difference is the audio section is completely unpopulated. There's nothing in the audio section. Everything is on the soundboard. So if you saw my burning EEPROM videos, you saw me burn these game ROMs, U26 and U27. I burned these on my new EEPROM burner. So now we're going to start by looking over the board. This CPU did work, by the way. And most all the functions that I checked on the game seemed to work. The first thing I did when I got the game is I cut the battery pack off. There was a little bit of fuzz on one of the batteries, so I just cut this off. We're going to deal with that in a little bit. But first we just want to look over the board, and what we're looking for is previous work, any previous work that was done on this board. And it actually does not look like there was any previous work done, except right here there is some ugly soldering right here, and it looks to be a transistor. So let's flip the board over. It is a transistor. So let's check these. Well, first let's pull the manual out, and I'm going to see what these transistors are supposed to be. So my transistor in question is at Q79. So if we look on here, Q79, and look on the list, and we're looking for Q79. Q79 is a tip 122 transistor. So I believe we check them by putting the, well, let's check one of the ones that we know is good. Put the positive on the top terminal. Put the negative lead of your meter on the tab, and then check the outside prongs, and we should have between 0.4 and 0.6. I got this on diode mode on my meter. Taking the red lead to one of the end tabs should have 0.4 to 0.6. There's 0.49. There's 0.46. Let's check another one to confirm. 0.46. 0.49. So now let's check this transistor that has the ugly solder on it. And I got 0.47 and 0.52. So that transistor is probably good. But the solder is really ugly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to desolder this and see what's going on and make sure the solder pads are still good. Let me go to continuity check here. And I'm just buzzing the traces on this. And they do seem... Alright, they are buzzing out, but it is pretty ugly, so I'd like to clean that up. So I'm going to do that right now. Alright, I wasn't able to just suck it out, and I happen to have some tip 122s, brand new, from Ed at Great Plains. There's so much solder on this, I'm having a hard time sucking it off. So I'm just going to clip it off and do it one tab at a time. I actually prefer to desolder things this way anyway. It's a lot safer for the board. So I just clip it off, and now I can use my needle nose pliers to pull one piece out at a time. Alright, so I got the part out, and it was real ugly. There was a whole bunch of flux on there. So I used some 91% alcohol and got all the extra flux up off of there. Now I'm just going to take my fiberglass pen and clean these joints up a little bit on both sides of the board. And now we got that nice solder, nice and shiny and clean of flux. And now we can solder in a new tip 122. Alright, so I'm going to take a new tip 122. The board is marked for orientation, and in this case I can use the other tipped 122s that are next to it for orientation purposes. I'm just going to put that in there, flip the board over, and solder it in. And we're going to solder it in a lot neater than the last person did. And then we're just going to clean off the extra flux. And we got our new tip 122 in, and we'll check that just like we did the other ones. 0.49 and 0.56. All right, since we're already at it, I'm just going to go around and check the rest of these transistors to make sure none of them are shorted or open. All right, so all these other transistors we were checking with negative on the tab and red on the outsides. This row right here are tip 42s, and these you check the opposite way. You take your red lead of your meter, put that on the tab, and then put the black on the outside legs, and you should get 0.4 to 0.5. Got 0.51, 0.56. Getting about 0.5 on all these. Alright, so all the transistors are checking out okay. So let's move on to these ceramic resistors. Will typically burn up. So first, you want to look for any broken legs. Make sure all the ceramic resistors are not broken. And then we'll look up, looks like these are 27 ohm. We'll confirm that on the CPU chart, R89 and up. R89. Yeah, 27 ohm resistors, so we'll put our meter on ohm, and we'll check these. 28 ohm, 28 ohm, 28 ohm, 28 ohm, 27 ohm, 27 ohm, 29 ohm, and 27 ohms. So they're all checking out all right. Now these look like, I think they say 0.4 ohm. Check that in the manual, R134 and up. Yeah, 0.4 ohms. 0.6, 0.6, 0.7, 0.6, 0.7, 0.7, 0.7, 0.7. All right, so all these resistors are checking out okay. There is a little heat burn here, but they're all checking out all right. I'm gonna leave them. So let's move on. While I'm here, I'm going to desolder the tabs that were left from when I cut off the battery. So I'm going to do it the same way I did that tip transistor. Just going to pull the legs out with a soldering iron and needle nose pliers. And now that I have all those pieces out, we're just going to suck the holes clean with a desoldering pump. And it's as easy as that. We got those nice and cleaned out. All right, so now we got to deal with the header pins. We want to reflow all the solder on these header pins. When you take the connectors on and off, it flexes these joints and it'll crack the solder joints a lot. We could go around with a magnifying glass and look for cracks, but it's always better to just reflow them all. It'll take 15 minutes or so to do it. So for this, quite simply, you just want to get your soldering iron and your fresh solder. And you just want to melt the old solder and add fresh solder to it. And let it flow out. And the most important thing to pay attention to here is you don't want to bridge two connectors together that aren't supposed to be bridged together. So make sure you check your work when you're done. And make sure you don't have any bridges. But just reflowing the solder on the header pins of most of these older pinball boards will help alleviate a lot of intermittent problems that you may have. So we got one done. I got, I don't know, 10 more to go. Alright, got all the solder reflowed on all the header pins. So now we have to deal with the battery. Alright, so what I'm going to use for a battery is I'm going to use a 2032 lithium. It's like a watch style battery. It's a 3-volt battery, which is enough to run the chip that we need to keep powered with the battery. And I have this little solder in 2032 battery holder. I got these from Big Daddy. I bought a whole bunch of them. I'm going to use these on all my boards from now on. The advantage to this battery is it's easy to change. They're cheap. The holders are cheap. And they don't leak. So it's in the past I always used remote 3 AA battery holders and mounted them on the side of the cabinet. But that's kind of a pain in the neck. This will work out a lot better. So we desoldered the holes. And if you look on the back of the board, there's already a blocking diode on the board. So we don't need to add one because this game used AA regular batteries. It didn't use a lithium rechargeable. So the positive is going to go to this positive tab that goes to the blocking diode. And the negative is going to go right next to it. And then we have to run a jumper wire from this terminal over to the actual ground plane. And that'll make this battery holder work. So again, we're going to need 2032 battery. We're going to need the battery holder. And we just need a piece of wire for a jumper wire. So the good thing about these holders is they fit in the holes that are already there for the battery holder. So we just need to solder that in. Alright, so we have our battery holder in with the positive going to the blocking diode. Flip the board over. And the negative is going to this trace that doesn't go anywhere at the current moment. So we're going to need to take this jumper wire and jump that over to the ground plane. Simple as that. So we'll take our wire, we'll take a wire stripper, we'll strip a little of that wire off. We'll pre-tin the wire. And we'll put it in the hole that goes to the ground plane. Solder that side in. And then we'll clip the wire to the length that we need. Peel some of the solder back. Tin that. Stick it in the other hole. And we'll solder that in. So now we're jumped to the ground plane on the negative. We'll flip the board over. It looks fine. All right, so before we put the battery in, I'm going to put my meter on continuity. And I'm going to go from the positive of our battery holder to the blocking diode. And make sure it buzzes. That's good. And then we're going to go from our negative on the battery holder to ground, and it buzzes. So we are connected properly. So now we will take our battery, and don't forget these batteries have a little protective coating on the bottom. Make sure you peel that off, otherwise your battery won't work. These batteries, the positive is the top, the negative is the bottom, so the writing on the battery is going to go up. All right, we got our battery in, so let's put our meter on volts. So if we put our positive on the top of the battery and go to the ground plane, we get 2.5 volts. So if we leave our negative on the ground and we go to the front side of the blocking diode coming off the battery, it should read the same as the battery. And on the other side of the blocking diode, there should be a voltage drop, and there is. So we have 2.3 on the opposite side of the blocking diode, and then we come up to this chip right here. The first pin on the end here, we should have the battery voltage. We got 2.3. So we got the voltage there, so we know that the battery is hooked up properly. Alright, so I popped the battery back out for now. Not going to be powering up the game anytime real soon, so there's no reason to leave it in there. Alright, so the CPU board I am considering done now. We checked all the tip transistors. We replaced the one questionable solder jointed tip transistor, which is the only previous work I see on this board, which is good. We burned new game ROMs at U26 and U27. We reflowed all the header pins. We checked all the ceramic resistors for both the value and to make sure that none of the leads were broken. We put a CR2032 lithium battery holder on the board. And just gave the board a good look over and make sure that none of these resistors were cracked or anything like that. So this board is now ready to go back into the game, and that's what I'm going to do right now. Alright, we got the CPU board in the head, and I took all the wiring from the cabinet and we hooked up some of the connectors for all the wires coming to the cabinet. I got my laptop here. I used that to make sure I had the connectors in the right location. I also labeled these, so I double and triple checked to make sure they were hooked up right. So now that's all together, and that'll do it for this episode. So let's go back to the workshop. Alright, so that's going to do it for this episode. Part number 5 of the Williams Rollergames restoration. We got a lot done in this video. I'm very happy with the progress that we made. The cabinet is now all together in the game room. All the circuit boards have been gone through and are done. The head's all back together. So we got a lot done in this episode. Next episode, we have the rest of the wiring harness needs to go back into the cabinet. The wiring harness, the rest of the wiring harness that we cleaned in the dishwasher. We need to work on the insert board. We're going to be repainting the insert board, and also going to be adding the 15 flashers into that insert board. We need to go through the display panel and clean all the display panel up, repaint the board, clean the plastic, go through the display board itself to make sure it's in good shape and see if anything needs to be replaced. So that's all going to be next time, and hopefully by the end of next video, part number 6, we'll be bringing that playfield out here and getting it back here on that rotisserie. I'm really looking forward to digging into the playfield. It's my favorite part of doing the restoration, is doing the playfield. So hopefully that will happen at the end of part number 6, the next episode coming up. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, part number 5 of Williams Rollergames Restoration. Please hit subscribe if you're not subscribed to my channel. Please feel free to leave comments down below. Feel free to share my channel. Also, if you'd like me to read a comment, or you have a question you'd like me to answer on the video, please send me an email to fierodoug@gmail.com. That information's at the bottom of the description for this video. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you learned something. Hope you get out into your pinball workshop and start restoring your games. This is Pin Dude from My Vintage Pinball. See you next time.